Welcome, everyone. We're diving straight into this explainer on the rapidly escalating situation at the Delaney Hall ICE Detention Center in Newark, New Jersey. It's an intense clash of federal power, corporate contracts, and grassroots resistance. Now, before we even really get into the weeds, you should know that many of the original sources reporting on this are so deeply engaged with the crisis right now that they're actually opening their reports with a direct call to action, urging folks to donate to local mutual aid funds like the NJ Alliance for Immigrant Justice. That really gives you a sense of just how active, how live this situation is on the ground. So today, we're going to break down the mechanics of this standoff, relying purely on the data, the documents, and the on-the-ground reporting. Let's get into it. Okay, here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll look at the billion-dollar contract. Then, the conditions and the strike. Next, the transfer blockade. And finally, the limits of local oversight. Starting with Section 1. The billion-dollar contract and reactivating Delaney Hall. You literally can't separate the massive protests happening right now from the underlying business model of this facility. I mean, we're not talking about a small temporary holding center here. Delaney Hall is operated by the private prison giant GEO Group under a staggering 15-year, $1 billion federal contract. Billion with a B. It holds up to 1,000 people. And here's what the sources constantly zero in on regarding its internal economics. To keep overhead low, the facility heavily relies on a detainee labor program. They're paying individuals roughly $1 a day to handle essential services, like the kitchen and janitorial work. As you can probably guess, that specific economic model totally sets the stage for the labor strike we're seeing today. Which brings us to this incredibly fascinating legal maneuver, because the facility reopening at all actually faced some serious hurdles. Get this. Back in 2021, New Jersey passed a law explicitly banning private immigration detention agreements. So how is Delaney Hall even open? Well, federal courts invoked the Supremacy Clause. That's the constitutional doctrine stating federal law basically trumps state law. Using that clause, they struck down New Jersey's ban entirely, allowing the federal government and GEO Group to just bypass state-level resistance and reopen the 1,000-bed center anyway. That takes us into Section 2, Conditions and the Strike. And man, this is truly a dispute of realities. Fast forward to May 2026, and the friction between those corporate operations and the detainees' actual lived experiences hits an absolute boiling point. Following an unannounced oversight visit, Representative LaMonica McIver amplified an SOS letter that was smuggled out and signed by nearly 300 detainees. The reporting highlights some harrowing allegations of extreme medical neglect. For example, activists frequently point to the tragic death of 41-year-old detainee John Wilson Brutus in December 2025. He died within just 24 hours of arriving. Advocates claim his death stemmed directly from systemic negligence, alleging that GEO Group staff actually held an ambulance at the gates for 5 crucial minutes just so they could prioritize processing new arrivals. So what we have here is a remarkably stark contrast between two simultaneous narratives. On one hand, detainees and advocates say that on May 22nd, roughly 300 people kicked off a coordinated hunger and labor strike, citing awful conditions, things like worms in the food, absolutely no air conditioning, and severe medical neglect. But on the flip side, the Department of Homeland Security issued a flat-out, unequivocal denial. DHS insists all meals are dietitian-reviewed, medical access is continuous, and they stated, quote, "There is no hunger strike at Delaney Hall." So how on earth is there such a massive discrepancy? Well, to understand the government's total denial, you have to look at ICE's own internal metrics. According to the sources, ICE requires a detainee to miss 9 consecutive meals or go a full 72 hours without food and water before a hunger strike officially goes on the books. Civil rights groups are arguing that this is just a bureaucratic loophole designed to underreport protests and basically ignore starving people. The government, however, maintains it's simply their standard administrative threshold. Moving right along to Section 3, the transfer blockade, the standoff on Dormis Avenue. Naturally, the strike inside quickly mobilized direct action on the outside. Over Memorial Day weekend, things accelerated really fast. Friday, May 22nd, the internal strike begins. By Sunday evening, May 24th, that situation spilled into the streets as a physical standoff, which ultimately culminated in a violent clearing in the early hours of Monday, May 25th. So let's zoom in on what actually sparked that midnight clash. The real flashpoint happened when ICE tried to forcefully transfer a key organizer of the hunger strike, Martin Soto, to a completely different facility in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Soto's pregnant wife, Gabriella, alerted supporters that he was being dragged into a transport van. In response, protesters literally put their bodies and their cars in the way to blockade the exit. The reporting tells us this human barricade held for hours until 1:25 a.m.
That's when ICE tactical officers and Newark police moved in with batons and pepper spray to forcibly clear the 70 or so protesters and finish the transfer.
Right after that blockade, the clampdown was swift. A DHS spokesperson announced that ICE was indefinitely suspending all family and legal visitation, blaming it on safety concerns from the protests. Now, advocates quickly pointed out that this effectively severed all direct communication between the striking detainees and the outside world. It essentially created a total information blackout exactly when the crisis was at its peak. This brings us to our final section, the limits of local oversight and what experts are calling the jurisdictional wall. With communication cut off, local and state officials stepped up to try and intervene. But this is where the story pivots from a standard protest into a full-blown constitutional crisis. Local authorities found themselves completely neutralized by what analysts term federal carceral sovereignty. The city of Newark even sued the GEO Group, saying they opened without municipal safety permits and complained that city inspectors were physically locked out. But the wildest example of this jurisdictional wall? On May 25th, New Jersey Governor Mikey Sherrill physically went to the gates to inspect the conditions and was formally denied entry by ICE and GEO Group. They just shielded themselves right behind that federal authority and the Supremacy Clause we talked about earlier. And the limits of this oversight go way beyond just getting locked out. It's actually crossed over into criminal prosecution. Remember Representative LaMonica Miver? Well, she's currently fighting a federal indictment over an altercation that happened during an unannounced inspection of Delaney Hall back in May 2025. She's facing 3 felony counts of assaulting and impeding federal officers, which carries a potential sentence of up to 17 years in prison. She completely maintains her innocence, arguing she was just doing her legally mandated job. Her upcoming appeal before the Third Circuit Court is relying heavily on the Speech or Debate Clause, a constitutional protection for members of Congress. This is setting up a massive, absolutely unprecedented legal showdown over the separation of powers. The courts are basically going to have to decide, can a sitting member of Congress be criminalized by the Department of Justice simply for trying to perform oversight on an executive branch facility? I mean, this is a case that could fundamentally shift the balance of power in the U.S. government. Which leaves us with this profound, really uncomfortable question. When a privatized federal facility starts operating almost like its own sovereign nation, superseding state laws, blocking the actual governor, and triggering the criminal prosecution of congressional reps, where does accountability even exist? Who guarantees the safety of the 1,000 people inside? The advocates on the ground close out their messages in the original sources with a very firm demand. Free them all, shut down Delaney Hall. And as they push the public to look past the billion-dollar contracts to the human lives at stake, they ask us to approach this entire crisis with, quote, open hearts and open minds. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it helped clarify the incredibly complex layers of this ongoing standoff.